The Seattle Kraken officially introduced Lane Lambert today. Here are some of my takeaways on this bonus episode of Locked On Kraken.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It's a good day, Seattle hockey fans. I would think that it's a good day. We introduce our newest head coach ahead of season 5. The Seattle Kraken had an introductory press conference for Lane Lambert, and Jason Botterill was at the dais with him. Before we get into that, I want to let you know this bonus episode of Locked On Kraken brought to you by our friends at Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. So we are going to have a full episode that will be Tuesday's episode, but as I mentioned on today, Monday's episode, I wanted to give you some takeaways. I knew that Lane Lambert was going to be speaking to media today, and so I wanted to make sure I took some notes on this really wide piece of paper and gave you some of my initial thoughts. The first thing that we heard out of the gate, Jason Botterill talking about Lane Lambert being a winner. He mentioned, of course, winning a Stanley Cup with the Washington Capitals, and there is some carryover to this Seattle Kraken roster, and that we'll talk about that more on Tuesday. But we also heard that, he has been in 21 playoff series. Now, not a lot of that experience is coming as a head coach. We've talked about that before, and I'll break it down the numbers a little bit more tomorrow. But what we're hearing is Lane Lambert is a winner. What Jason Botterill also stressed and came up a lot in the press conference was the balancing act of being able to connect with veterans while also, of course, making sure to connect with the young talent on this Seattle Kraken roster. A lot of people think Lane can do that. What we also heard and what we had been hearing, but this is coming officially today, Jess, as in Jessica Campbell, will be back. Now, what that looks like as far as the rest of the coaching staff, that is in, as Lane Lambert said, an evaluating process. There are some conversations to be had, thinking about what needs to be stressed, things of that nature. Again, I'll go into that a little bit more on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Kraken. And what we heard from Jason Botterill a few times is that this was a process. They spoke with Lane Lambert a handful of times, and that throughout the process, that Lane Lambert started to emerge as, quote, the perfect fit. And, there were several interviews. It was about feeling comfortable with having Lane Lambert as a new head coach, given his expertise and knowing what the Seattle Kraken want to focus on. So again, this is their guy. This is their guy. So I think that's going to be interesting. I did appreciate there was a question about the PWHL, and it was actually Jason Botterill who took that on, talking about how Megan Turner, who is the general manager of PWHL Seattle, the PWHL expansion draft happens tonight. Megan has already reached out to the front office of the Seattle Kraken, and Lane Lambert talked about being in Toronto and having that overlap, of course, with the Toronto Scepters. And so I thought that was interesting. Something else that really stood out and that I'm going to really hold this coaching staff and this organization to task with is when it came to the idea of team toughness. And Allison Lucan posted something on Blue Sky that I want to show y'all because I also thought it was a great quote. Here is what Allison Lucan posted. Appreciate this quote from Coach Lambert. The quote reads, "A non-negotiable is playing the right way. Everyone has to be on the same page, and when they are, you will have success. Everyone is responsible for a job, a role. Everyone knows what that role is, and there won't be any gray areas. My job is to provide an environment for our players to have success, make sure they are ready to go, and understand what their job is." And I do think that this was a bit of a problem. It was problematic at times. Now, granted, you can talk about injuries, as I often do, with the Seattle Kraken, and if and how they impacted what the team was able to do and how they were able to execute. However, Jared McCann is an example, got lost in the sauce, as I've been saying a lot, as I did say a lot last season, and even on the most recent episode, because I talked about what our guys Flip and Steele were talking about on Locked On Fantasy Hockey. This is an organization where inconsistency at all levels has impacted the play on the ice. Yes, there is inconsistency, individual inconsistency, collective inconsistency at the player level, and I have talked about that. I will continue to talk about that, but also there's been inconsistencies elsewhere, and I'm very curious to see if and how Lane Lambert can right the ship. When it comes to team toughness, other things that stood out to me is that he said, if something isn't right, you take care of it. You best believe I'll get into that a little bit more on tomorrow's episode. But he also mentioned getting to hard areas, winning 50-50 puck battles, everydayers and OGers. I talk about that so much. And I loved hearing a coach talk about that. Now, what that looks like as far as the execution on the ice, I'm very curious. But the fact that we can have a conversation about how important it is to win 50-50 puck battles, to get to the net, to get into certain areas, hard areas of the ice. He's saying a lot of things that make me pretty excited. And again, there are a lot of things that he said about defense. You best believe I'll have an entire segment just on breaking down a very specific thing that he said about defense and how I think it can impact the Seattle Kraken. But let me know in the comments, were you able to watch the press conference? Don't worry, I'll have clips for you on tomorrow's episode. But if you were able to watch it, what stood out to you? What questions do you still have? And as always, I'm scouring the comments on YouTube. So if you have something to say, you want me to read it or respond to it on the Locked On Kraken podcast, make sure you subscribe to Locked On Kraken on YouTube. Hit the notification bell so you always know when we go, if I'm going live or there's a scheduled. I'm going to have a lot more scheduled episodes coming up. You will always be able to find those when you hit the notifications. And finally, you can find the Locked On Kraken podcast on TikTok at Locked On Kraken. You can also find me personally on Blue Sky at elindsay08. That's ELINDSAY08. Hold fast, stay true, and loud and proud we say, let's go Kraken. Until then, be kind to yourself, be kind to one another, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Peace out, everybody.